If you're hearing the phrase 10-day countdown, this is exactly what it means. President Donald Trump has not launched strikes on Iran's energy plants yet, but he has publicly tied a deadline to that threat. And at the same time, the United States is building up serious naval and air power in the region. So, yes, this story is about Iran's energy grid. Yes, it is about a growing U.S. fleet presence. And yes, the next several days could shape what happens in the Gulf, in oil markets, and across the wider Middle East. This is not just another war headline. This is a pressure campaign built around time, fuel, shipping lanes, and military leverage. Because when Washington starts talking about energy plants instead of just military facilities, the message changes completely. You're no longer discussing a symbolic strike. You're talking about the systems that keep a country running: electricity, refining, industrial, output, domestic stability, and political pressure. And when that message arrives, alongside aircraft carriers, destroyers, stealth fighters, surveillance aircraft, and troop movements, it stops sounding like rhetoric for headlines and starts looking like a calibrated effort to force a strategic decision in Tehran. According to Reuters, Trump said on March 26th that he would pause attacks on Iran's energy plants for 10 days at Tehran's request, and that talks were going very well. But in that same broader confrontation, he also kept the pressure very public, making clear that if Iran refuses U.S. demands, the military option remains on the table. That is the key tension driving this entire story. A pause is in place, but the coercive pressure behind it has not disappeared. In fact, the pause may be dangerous precisely because it creates a countdown. It gives every side a clock to watch. And that clock matters because this is no longer just about one bilateral dispute. The real battlefield here is the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which a massive share of the world's oil and LNG flows. If Iran can threaten shipping there, it gains leverage far beyond its borders. If the U.S. can convince Iran that pressure on Hormuz will trigger unbearable costs at home, Washington changes the equation. So what you are watching is not only a military standoff, it is a contest over who controls the price of escalation. That is why the fleet story is so important. The Associated Press reported that Trump said the USS Gerald R, the world's largest aircraft carrier, would head to the Middle East very soon to join the USS Abraham Lincoln strike group and other U.S. assets already in the region. That is not a routine signal. One carrier can project power. Two carriers create options. They expand sortie rates, deepen strike capacity, improve survivability, and give planners redundancy if the crisis grows. In simple terms, it means Washington is not just trying to be seen, it is trying to be ready. And the buildup does not stop at the carriers. AP also reported that the broader U.S. posture now includes at least 16 Navy ships in the region, more than 100 fighter jets moving from U.S. and European bases, over 100 fuel tankers, hundreds of cargo aircraft, early warning platforms, and additional stealth aircraft positioned closer to the theater. Some U.S. troops have already arrived. This is not the footprint of a symbolic warning. It is the architecture of a campaign designed to deter, pressure, and if needed, strike while defending against retaliation. Now here is the part many headlines miss. The point of threatening Iran's energy plants is not only to destroy hardware, it is to create a strategic dilemma inside the Iranian system. Tehran can continue pressuring shipping, keep refusing U.S. demands, and hold to a harder negotiating line. But if that choice raises the risk of power outages, refinery disruption, industrial strain, or further economic shock at home, then the leadership has to decide whether external leverage is worth internal pain. That is why energy infrastructure is such a powerful pressure point. It does not just hit capabilities, it hits confidence. But the plan carries enormous risk for Washington, too. Reuters reported that Gulf states warned the U.S. directly that strikes on Iran's power plants could trigger retaliation against their own vital energy and desalination facilities. That changes everything. Suddenly, the issue is no longer whether the U.S. can punish Iran. Of course it can. The issue becomes whether punishing Iran opens a much bigger regional chain. Reaction, one that drags Gulf infrastructure, commercial shipping, and global commodity markets into the fire. And once that happens, even countries that are not part of the original confrontation start paying the bill. That is why Trump's pause may tell us two things at once. First, it suggests the White House wanted to preserve leverage while buying time for talks. Second, it may indicate that regional partners made it clear the cost of immediate escalation was higher than Washington first assumed. In other words, this is not necessarily a retreat. It may be a recalibration. A pause can mean hesitation, but it can also mean preparation. And in geopolitics, the difference between those two interpretations can decide whether markets calm down or panic. Now look at this from Tehran's perspective. Iran's leadership has taken damage, but according to regional reporting and analyst assessments cited by Reuters and AP, it does not appear willing to simply absorb pressure and fold. Tehran has signaled that if its core systems are Threatened, it can answer asymmetrically through shipping disruption, missile pressure, proxy networks, and attacks that raise costs without requiring a conventional head-to-head war with the United States. That is the Iranian model. Do not match America ship for ship or plane for plane, make the environment too expensive, too unstable, and too politically painful. And that is exactly why the Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of this story. Control of that passage is not just a military issue. It is financial leverage, insurance leverage, shipping leverage, and inflation leverage. If flows are disrupted, oil rises. If oil rises, transport costs rise. If transport costs rise, consumer prices and industrial input costs can rise far beyond the Middle East. Reuters noted that the broader conflict has already pushed crude higher, disrupted shipping, and raised costs in sectors like LNG and fertilizers. So when people say this crisis could hit everyday life, that is not dramatic language. That is basic supply chain math. This is also why the phrase energy grid is politically explosive. Military targets can be explained as part of a security operation. Energy systems are different. They affect civilians, business continuity, hospitals, communications, water systems, and national mood. That means any move in this direction would come with major political, legal, and reputational consequences. For a YouTube audience, the simplest way to understand it is this. Targeting energy infrastructure is what states threaten when they want to force a decision quickly. But it is also the kind of move that can turn a limited confrontation into a much wider crisis. So what happens next? There are three major paths, and every one of them is dangerous in a different way. The first path is de-escalation through a narrow deal. In this scenario, the 10-day pause becomes a pressure tool that helps create indirect understandings. Shipping access improves. Some channels of communication stay open. Rhetoric remains harsh and public, but both sides quietly step back from the edge. This would be the least disruptive outcome for markets and for regional governments, but it is also the hardest to sell politically, because both Trump and Iran's leadership would need to present restraint as strength, not weakness. The second path is a limited strike scenario. Here, talks fail or stall, and Washington decides that it must reassert credibility without going into a full regional war. That could mean selective action tied to power infrastructure or related strategic nodes, paired with a message that the U.S. still wants to avoid a broader fight. On paper, this is the classic controlled escalation model. In practice, it is incredibly unstable. Once you hit a state's core systems, you cannot fully control how that state chooses to answer. The third path is the most dangerous. Prolonged standoff with rolling retaliation. Not a full invasion, not a formal declaration of war, but a drawn-out cycle of pressure, counter-pressure, market shocks, shipping disruptions, and military signaling. This is the nightmare scenario for the global economy because it does not need one massive event. It just needs constant uncertainty. Insurers raise premiums, shippers reroute, energy traders price and risk, governments prepare emergency options, and all of that can happen even if neither side officially says it wants a larger war. Now let's talk about the fleet again, because the arrival of U.S. naval power is not just about attack plans. It is also about deterrence and protection. 2, carrier groups mean stronger air defense, stronger maritime surveillance, better escort options, and more confidence for U.S. planners if Iran or aligned forces try to pressure shipping or regional bases. This matters because AP's reporting suggests the current force package is built not only for striking targets, but also for absorbing and responding to retaliation. In other words, Washington may be trying to build a posture that says, if you escalate, we are prepared for the second round too. But preparation can cut both ways. The more forces you move in, the greater the chance of misreading signals. A drone gets too close, a radar lock is misinterpreted, a warning shot becomes an incident, a local commander acts faster than diplomats. History is full of crises that did not begin. Because leaders wanted war, but because armed systems were operating inside a political environment with almost no trust left. The more crowded the theater becomes, the more fragile deterrence can become. That is why the next 10 days are psychologically important, even if no strike happens. Deadlines concentrate attention. They force media, cycles, military readiness, diplomatic backchannels, and market speculation into the same narrow window. Everyone starts acting not on what has happened, but on what they think might happen next. That can be useful if you are trying to squeeze concessions. It can also be dangerous if every actor starts feeling pressured to prove resolve before the clock expires. There's another layer here that matters for a geopolitical audience: credibility. Trump's strategy depends on convincing Iran that delay will only worsen Tehran's position. Iran's strategy depends on convincing Washington that coercion will trigger costs far beyond Iran itself. So this is not simply about weapons. It is about which side can shape the other side's expectations. Can the U.S. make the deadline feel real enough to force movement? Or can Iran make retaliation feel broad enough to weaken American leverage? That is the true contest taking place behind the headlines. And this is where energy markets become part of strategy, not just consequence. If oil spikes sharply, Washington faces economic and political blowback. If Gulf states feel exposed, coalition discipline weakens. If Asian importers fear a deeper shipping crisis, outside pressure for de-escalation rises. Iran knows all of that. The US knows Iran knows it. That is why this standoff feels so tense. Each side is trying to weaponize the other side's vulnerabilities without crossing into a zone it cannot control. So when some headlines frame this as fleet arrives, strike is next, that is too simple. The buildup may support a strike option, yes, but it also supports deterrence, bargaining, and insurance against retaliation. Likewise, when others say this pause means the danger has passed, that is also too simple. A pause with more assets flowing in is not the end of a crisis. It is often the phase where states position themselves for whichever door opens next. Diplomacy, limited. Force, or prolonged confrontation. For viewers trying to understand the bigger picture, here's the key takeaway. Iran's energy network, the U.S. carrier buildup, and the Strait of Hormuz are not three separate stories. They are one story. The energy threat is the pressure point. The fleet is the enforcement mechanism. Hormuz is the leverage arena. Put them together and you get a countdown crisis, where military signaling, negotiation, and market risk all move together. And that is why the phrase 10-day countdown should not be read as a guaranteed march toward strikes. It is better understood as a narrowing decision window. Trump has created a timeline around Iran's energy infrastructure while moving more military capability into place. Iran, meanwhile, appears determined to show that any move against its core systems could widen the cost across the region. Neither side wants to look weak. Neither side can fully trust the other. And that is exactly the kind of environment where even a pause can feel more dangerous than peace. So watch the next signals carefully. Any change in shipping access through Hormuz, any movement in carrier positioning, any new language from Tehran about negotiations, any additional Gulf warning, and any jump in oil that reflects fear rather than fundamentals. Those will tell you whether this countdown is leading toward a deal, a limited strike, or a longer period of managed instability. Because in the end, the most important question is not whether the United States has the power to hit Iran's energy infrastructure. It clearly has the capacity to threaten it. The real question is whether doing so would force compliance or ignite a bigger regional contest that neither side can fully contain. And over the next several days, that question may matter more than any speech, any post, or any single military movement. If this deadline holds, the next chapter will not be decided by the loudest rhetoric. It will be decided by who can impose pressure without losing control of the consequences.